J'ai le grand plaisir et le grand honneur d'introduire mon ami Hans Schultenolke, qui est professeur à l'université d'Osnabrück et qui est une grande figure au niveau du droit européen des contrats, où il est actif pour la Commission européenne et pour l'Europe entière depuis de très nombreuses années. J'ai l'honneur aussi de siéger avec lui dans le comité exécutif de l'European Law Institute. Et Hans s'investit énormément dans tout ce qui est digital, numérique et aussi voiture autonome. J'ai déjà eu l'occasion de l'écouter sur le sujet et il est passionnant. Donc je le remercie très fort d'être venu. Il s'est levé très très tôt pour être présent aujourd'hui parmi nous. Je l'en remercie au nom de notre université et je lui cède bien volontiers la parole.
Monsieur le Président, cher Denis, Mesdames et Messieurs, je me remercie par l'invitation et pour les mots d'introduction très gentils. J'ai naturellement préparé quelques phrases en français, mais pour gagner du temps, comme vous écoutez, j'ai besoin plus de temps pour parler français que dans d'autres langues. Je vais parler anglais. Mes excuses pour ça, mais nous pouvons discuter en français, naturellement, aussi. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm reporting you now about is more or less the result of a small working group of the European Law Institute. We had the question, we had quite a lot of proposals to work on liability issues for automated cars. Many people think, or at least thought, that the European legal landscape is not ready for automated cars. This may be the case here and there, but surprise, surprise, the result of our working group was that there are, regarding liability, hardly any problems. Of course, if you really zoom closely, you can find some, and I will show you at least those we found, but our group work ended, I'm not saying somehow sadly, that there is not much to do, at least for the European legislator, and on a second look and on a second thought, this is more a good than a bad result, but see what we found. I was late due to mainly traffic jams, and therefore I don't know precisely what you already worked about in the morning. Please don't be too confused. I'm anyway confused having French slides and speaking English, but at least I tried to put my English slides into French. Please also excuse all the mistakes I made in translating them, but at least I think you should know, probably you already know, that, let's say, the overarching legal background is the Vienna Convention on Road Traffic. This convention has many contracting states, regulates, among others, well, what cars must have for features. And this treaty, this convention, has been amended as a consequence of a proposal of 2014 made by European states. And the amendment has been adopted. It is already in force. Reads as you can read there. It says that cars may be registered and consequently operated legally on the road within the contracting states, even if they have, let's say, gadgets for autonomous driving, as long or provided that these automatic features can be disabled or overruled by the driver at any time. This is more or less the international answer to autonomous cars. It means that by far not all types of autonomous cars are legal in Europe and the other countries, but at least some. And just as a basic information, most contracting states have ratified this, and some of the contracting states have already adapted their national legislation or are about to do so. I will give you at least examples, as you can read there, for Germany and the United Kingdom. And I don't dare to give you any examples from Belgium, or hardly any, because you anyway know better. I do not want to bore you with all the different types of automatization. You may be familiar with the classification system of an American standardization organization, which distinguishes between 6 levels, level 0 to level 5. Level 5 means the car is completely on its own, doesn't even have any more a steering wheel. Level 4 means the driver can go to the back seat and sleep. Level 3 means the driver still has to sit in the driving seat, and of course there has to be a steering wheel and other instruments, but the driver is entitled to read newspaper or do anything else, but should at least be ready for taking over. You immediately realize that we are only speaking of level 3 cases in this terminology under the Vienna Treaty. All the other levels are simply not allowed. Well, to give you another piece of background, just for Germany, because statistics is easier to grasp, how many accidents and what are the costs of those accidents happen. Just in Germany, which is usually 1/5 of the European Union, we have about 2.4 million accidents per year. And in the statistics of the police, you can find something on the causes. This proves what everyone more or less says, that nearly 100% of accidents are due to human failure. The Germans only say 90%. The other reasons are weather conditions, road conditions, obstacles on the road, but on a closer look, it is often not just the weather conditions which cause the accident. It is usually also the failure of a human. What you might even find more interesting is how much these accidents cost. In Germany, it is about 20 billion of euros. And they are paid mainly by the car liability insurance. You see, in 2013 it was 12.6 millions, and they had incomings from premiums of 14 billions, which means they earned more than 1 billion, more or less, and that's important to have in mind. That's a big business. Car insurance is a very big business, and this is one of the key questions: who will more or less have this business after all cars are autonomous? The liability insurance pays more or less the damages at other cars, but not at the own car. If you want to have also the damages at your own car compensated, you have to conclude an insurance which we call in German, I think it's Italian, full casco. I think you know the word. And sometimes, but rarely, really rarely, car producers have to bear the costs of accidents. The main example now, before autonomous cars come, are tires. Damage of tires may sometimes lead, the exact figure is unknown, to responsibility, liability of the producer of the car, or sometimes even of the tire. The important information is, for the moment, all costs, nearly all costs of accidents are covered by insurances. The producers cover hardly anything, less than 1%. And that's precisely the question whether this will remain. But to be honest, on a second thought, who covers the costs of car accidents? It is, of course, not the insurances. It is finally the car owners. The car owners pay, of course, the fees, the premiums into the insurances. The insurances work as a big pool of, let's say, funds, which then covers all the accidents, which means it is a little bit short-sighted to say that the costs are being borne by the insurances. Actually, they are borne by the car owners. And that's precisely the question, whether this changes. Many people believe in product liability regarding autonomous cars and think that would change much. Honestly, it doesn't change much at all, because at the very end, it is again the car owner who pays the cost of the accidents. The only difference is the way where the money goes. The costs of the accidents need to be paid. Either the money for these costs go through the insurances, or the money goes through the price of cars. Because if the car producers get a greater share of the liability and a greater share of the costs, they will, of course, need to recover these costs. And if we stick to the traditional model of selling cars and not leasing cars, car producers only get money once, which is the price for the car. And they, of course, have to more or less add the costs for accidents, which may be costs for insurance, but also simply costs for a safety buffer in their balance on the price, which means irrespective how things are organized, finally it is always the owner of the car who pays the costs of accidents. Fortunately, not the poor owner whose car had the accident. It is the community of owners who pay the costs of accidents. I think that's clear. Well, if one looks a little bit closer on the liability system on a rather theoretical level, you can always read that the functions of tort law are three. One is compensation of damage. The other is prevention of damage by influencing human behavior. And the third is socialization of damage. Everything is, of course, true, but please keep in mind what I already told you. In our case, it's mainly, if not only, just socialization of damage. The car liability system is not for changing the conduct of drivers, because the drivers are insured too, which means it's only socialization. The owners pay. Currently in the insurance pays. Even if the drivers are heavily negligent, drivers are not liable, or in most countries they are liable, but they are insured. And therefore they need not pay, finally. If you zoom a little bit closer and ask what tort law does, you can say that tort law has to more or less make two major decisions. First is, who is responsible against the victim after a car accident? And you all know there's a long list of candidates. Can be the driver, can be the holder, can be the owner. Of course, the car insurance, it can be, and that's perhaps my topic, the manufacturer of the car, but perhaps even other persons, a cloud service provider or guarantee funds if no one is around. That's the first question tort law has to decide. Who is liable? In many tort law systems, even several of these persons are fully and jointly liable for the damages. And the second question is, of course, who is the poor, the person responsible for the damage, which must ultimately bear the cost of car accidents? And until now, as already explained, it is mainly the insurer, even though others may also be liable. Now, on the European regulation. You know perhaps that there is a directive on car liability. It's Directive 2009/103. However, you most probably know that this directive does not say very much on, let's say, the amount of damages one gets. The whole directive can be compared with an empty shell. It only says that the car insurer is liable and that the victim must have a direct claim against the car insurer. But let's say the content of this claim, the content of the empty shell, is not determined by this directive. It is determined by the applicable national law. Next question, what is the applicable national law? You most probably also know that this has to be determined under the Rome II regulation. And you know that the Rome II regulation again does not say anything on substantive law. It is only private international law which says which is the applicable law, which means in the end any national law is applicable. And of course you know which, it depends a little bit who crashes. It's normally the law of the place where the accident happens, except two bloody foreigners crash in another country, then it's their law. But that's more the exception than the rule. Usually foreigners crash with locals. In a picture, you see, I asked one of my sons to make this picture because he's better in that. Just as an explanation, you find some of the candidates listed there. Can be the driver, can be the holder or owner, can be the car insurer, can be the producer. No direct claim against any potential insurance of the producer, and of course one of these arrows is red, and you know already why, because any reasonable victim will not bother very much with all the other candidates, because diving into deep pockets is always good, and insurances are the safest defendant to sue. By the way, you may know that under another system, the Brussels 1A system, you can even sue the insurer with a seat in a foreign country, in your own country. Odenbreit is, I think, the catch name of the case of the European Court of Justice. That's a highly comfortable system. Therefore, any reasonable victim of an accident in a foreign country within this system of Brussels 1A just and only sues the car insurer, because this can be done at his place, jurisdiction, at the local court where the victim lives. Highly comfortable system, but more or less that's the present. We might have to speak about the future. And let's more or less be short about the future. Imagine for a moment the majority of cars are self-driving cars, and you start wondering who of the candidates listed are liable for an accident of such a self-driving car. The driver, as a rule, not. You can even say there is no driver as long as the car is in self-driving mode. That's, of course, only half of the truth. Sometimes the driver is required to take over control. For example, if the autonomous car tells him, please take over control, and if the driver then doesn't, then he or she is, of course, liable. But that's the exception. Let's stay for a moment by an autonomous car in which does not tell the driver anything. Then, of course, the question is whether the owner or holder of the car is liable. And if we zoom closer, we find in some countries, yes, Germany without any doubt. In the Netherlands, for example, only in case the autonomous car collided with a pedestrian or cyclist, but not with another car. Then the holder is liable. Belgian law, I tried to find out, if I got 1384 of the Code Civil right, the holder is only, or the owner is only liable in case the damage is caused by a defect of the car. Hopefully that's true, otherwise please correct it on your own. In other countries, it is pretty clear that the holder is not liable, until now in the UK, in Ireland, in Poland, and my example from Netherlands again, if the car crashed into another car. Then, of course, the car insurer, no problem in Germany, because anyway the holder is liable and therefore insured. No problem in France, they have their own system, the holder is not liable, but just the car insurer is liable as a rule under the system. Belgium, I guess it's the same. The insurance is only liable if the holder is liable in our case, which means if the damage is caused by a defect. In other countries, the car insurer is not liable, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Poland, and Netherlands in the example. Okay, and this shows there are gaps. Gaps mean problem. There can't be liability gaps. Victims of car accidents must be recompensated in a very easy way, which means against a very strong defendant. This could be, of course, the producer, and that's why many people believe in product liability. On the first sight, it looks fine. There is a European directive on product liability, and which would, as a rule, also deliver a claim against the producer. However, even on a legal side, you discover immediately some dramatic gaps. I listed some. For example, the victim must prove that the car was defect. Quite difficult issue. You know there was an accident, but you don't know whether the reason was a defect. Could be also bad road conditions or so. And of course, causality. There is an exemption for the development risk made use of in most states, I think except Finland. And it is probably that very often it is the development risk which causes the accident. There's a prescription period. It's mandatory full harmonization 10 years, which is much too short. And some countries even have a cap on the overall liability for one product. That's also too low. And even worse, there is no insolvency protection at all. And we don't know whether the producer of the cars are the big, more or less unfailable car producers, can be also very small ones or small importers, which can fall easily insolvent, which means there's again a gap in product liability. And that's the reason, because many people think that product liability needs to be reformed, which means there is a problem. I skip, because of time reasons, the situation in the United Kingdom. United Kingdom government has seen the problem and has brought a bill, it is already in the House of Lords, with an interesting, totally reasonable, as always with Brits, solution. They make, but just for automatic cars, the holder liable, and if the car is not insured, otherwise, automatic cars insures, the insurance is liable. If the car is not insured, the holder is liable. That's, of course, perfectly. The Germans had no problem with liability, but they only wanted to be a little bit more precise on what the driver must do, and therefore the new German paragraph 1b of the Road Traffic Act says more or less that the driver may turn away from the traffic and read newspaper, of course not literally, but that's meant. But he must remain so perceptive that he can fulfill any duties at any time. And which duties? You find this, if you can read German, in paragraph 2. It says the driver is obliged, wait a minute, to take over the control immediately. Firstly, when the car tells him, and second, when he should realize without the car telling him that something is going very wrong. That has nothing to do with liability. It makes, of course, the driver liable, but he is anyway the third in the row because the holder is liable anyway, and there is obligatory car insurance and direct claims. Therefore, it has nothing to do with liability. Regulates only the question whether the driver can be punished, for example. But liability system is more or less settled. It looks as only in a few countries, which could be also Belgium, but that's more a question to you than an answer I'm giving you, nearly all problems are solved, and I think the EU legislator for the moment can trust that most other countries discover that there's a problem, as the Brits already have done, and close the gap. And therefore, product liability does not matter so much. There may be very good reasons for reform of the product liability system, but automated cars are not the reason. However, there is one problem perhaps not entirely solved. I skip a little bit in order to gain time. The question of recourse, redress. Whether the car insurer, in case the accident has been caused by a defect of an autonomous car, can have recourse against the producer. You see immediately, this has nothing to do with protection of victims. Victims are protected anyway. The only question is whether the car insurer, which is, as a rule, liable, except in those countries where are these rather tiny gaps, it has much to do with the risk structure and the whole system who finally bears the costs. And now I'm returning to the very beginning. Until now, it is just the owners via their insurance fees. And the only question is whether fully or partially the channel through which the money flows should be changed, and why? And that's indeed an open question, and the main, let's say, trigger or the main argument has nothing to do with protection of victims, protection of citizens. It has much to do with a heavy, sometimes some people even say dirty, industrial policy issue. Whether the legal systems have an interest to protect the producers. A kind of sandboxing in the recourse system is at least something one should seriously consider. I gave you an example which is totally hypothetical, but just in order to illustrate what the effect would be if you assume that nearly all accidents are caused by defects of autonomous cars in a rather remote future. Then the risk of costs for accidents of the producers dramatically increases in my very theoretical table from 1 billion to 40 billion for Europe or so. One could consider to more or less reduce or limit the recourse. My example, just as a theoretical example, to 50%. That would mean that the producers anyway have a dramatic increase of their risk, but only 20 billion. And the other 20 billion, of course, remain at the insurances. I must say I have some sympathy for such system. It's a rather proactive industrial policy, and it's much safer because you leave the structure of the obligatory car insurance, the direct claim, and the holder or insurance liability fully in force and more or less move all questions to the recourse issues. That's much safer than relying just on product liability for the reasons I already explained. And it might be even better for Europe, and that's, of course, a question, as I said, of industrial policy, which is sometimes or may be considered as a kind of dirty question. Therefore, there are perhaps political decisions to make. One would be, I'm not advocating this, but the EU could at least tell those member states which don't have either a holder liability or a direct liability of car insurers along the French model to introduce something like this in order to conclude those gaps. And of course, one at least could think about on European harmonization of the right of recourse, of course, just specifically for autonomous cars. This could be easily done within the Directive 2009/103 if the EU wants to protect its industries and facilitate the introduction of cars. This has nothing to do with ethics. There are ethical problems, of course, but the liability problems are no ethical problems at all. Simple legal problems, most of them already solved. It has something to do with industrial policy. I elaborated a little bit more on that, mainly in German, but also that's the broadest thing I did. I did it paid by the insurance industry, but then, and of course, I believe in this solution, but the real issue is who gets the big market of the 20 billion. If the car producers want this market, they have to declare, and they can do, although already has done, as you may know, their full liability for any accident, irrespective what the reason was, caused in the operation of an automated cars. And that's precisely the question we are looking forward to. I don't think that the legislator is needed in case the system moves to product liability, not so much because of the directive, because of own declarations of the producers to take the full risk. The legislator has to intervene in order to protect victims against insolvency of producers. That's perhaps a big issue. The other issues, at least we found in our working group, are small issues, nearly solved. I trust that most member states will be able to solve them on their own. Sorry for destroying your hope of a big legal reform and writing so many books. Perhaps I'm totally wrong, but if not, I'm very surprised that the current system rather well operates already without much amendment. Thank you very much for your attention.